Here we go. Welcome, everyone. We are set to chat about iPhone photography today with the iPhone 14 having been released recently and some other interesting developments, including a big app release that happened just minutes ago, about in the last hour or so, I think. Halide made a big update to their camera app to now fully support the iPhone 14. So I'm just going to say, start right off the bat. If you've got a question, a comment, a thought on iPhone photography, please drop that in the chat. My plan today is to talk about what you want to talk about. I have a few things on my list as well that we can cover. Were you one of the early adopters? Did you get the new iPhone 14? My iPhone 14 Pro, the purple one that looks, it's purple if you turn it just right. It's not purple like my walls are purple, but it's purple in the right light. I don't know why Apple doesn't give the Pro phones the crazy, wild, brilliant colors, but hey, Pros are supposed to go for all black, right? No. So, although I do say I like what they did with the all black in this year's, iPhone Pro line. It is a nice, solid, very black. It reminds me of the shirt that you occasionally see where they say, the reason I wear black is because they haven't invented something darker yet. But all that said, we can talk about things beyond the color of the iPhone. Let's talk about photography. So I think the big thing with the iPhone 14 when it comes to photography is the 48 megapixel sensor on the Pro models. And now that we've had those in the wild for a few days, people are realizing a few things. One is that 48 megapixels is a lot of megapixels. It's a lot of pixels that we can edit with. It's big files. If you shoot a 48 megapixel RAW file, it's 75, 80 megabytes, depending on what's in that image. And that's a big file. That's probably a bigger file than you want to work with for your casual snapshots. And so I think the workflow that I'm going to fall into is using the iPhone's built-in camera, probably the built-in camera app for kind of the casual day-to-day, everyday snapshots, the things that I just happen to photograph, around the house, things that photographically speaking are not that important. And then I'll be using Halide, which is my favorite third-party camera app. I'll drop a link to that in the description when the stream replay goes up. For my real serious iPhone photos, when I've got the challenging light situations, I'm going to shoot in that RAW format. I'm going to shoot 48 megapixels in that RAW format. And as I mentioned with the Halide update that dropped this morning, that's now even easier to do. And what Halide did is they answered one of the common criticisms that I noticed in my first take with the iPhone 14 camera app, and other people did as well, which is that Apple makes it difficult to switch between 12 megapixels and 48 megapixels if you're doing raw captures. You have to go into the settings app. In fact, I did a video that explains how to do this. I'll drop that link down below as well. And in fact, I could find that link and drop it into the chat room and be helpful now, couldn't I? That would be a nice thing for me to do. So if you're wondering, how do you switch between 12 and 48 megapixels? I'm going to drop that into the chat here. Switching between 48 megapixels. So you can go view that video that I did, but basically you go into the camera settings and go into the formats, go to RAW, and then change between 12 and 48 megapixels. That's how that all works. But Apple doesn't give you a toggle in the camera app. Well, Halide answered that. In fact, if this works, I should be able to switch over. I took a screenshot of what the Halide interface looks like. There we go. So as you can see, in the Halide interface, if you look at the controls, they have a place where they display the format that you're shooting in, how high quality is that image. And if you press on that indicator for just a moment, a menu pops up like you can see right here, where it gives you the option to switch between 12 and 48 megapixels. And it also gives you the option to switch between the Apple Pro RAW or Halide's native DNG RAW format that it uses. The plus in Halide, if you're not familiar with that, basically determines whether or not it's also capturing a compressed file, an HEIC or a JPEG or not. And so, what you're looking at in this screenshot I have right here is it's just 48 megapixel RAW file. That's all that I'm capturing. And so that is a nice little camera toggle that Apple has not given us yet in the native camera app. Now, I would guess that we're going to see this in an iOS 16 update, where they will give us an easier way to switch between capture formats and capture format size from within the camera app, because we can switch RAW on or off right now. There's the little indicator up in the corner to do that, but we can't switch between 12 and 48 megapixels. And, more isn't always better. We don't always want those giant file sizes, because the other impact is that it's slower to capture because the file size is so much bigger. There's so much more image data to process. It takes a little bit longer. And so the camera app isn't as responsive. It's not as nimble if you are using the giant file sizes, because we don't really need that huge file size. And I think this is an interesting other point that sometimes gets lost in, especially in online discussions about smartphone cameras. There was a discussion I was viewing on Reddit the other day, and I chose not to dive into that foray, but people were talking about the 48 megapixels with the iPhone camera and what it really meant. And, the reality is, if you're capturing images that you're going to share to social media, if you're capturing images you're going to post to Instagram or Flickr or Glass or whatever your social network of choice is, and people are going to view those, on their iPhone, on their Android phone, wherever the case may be. If it's mobile photography viewed by mobile photographers on mobile photography devices, you're not going to be able to probably tell a difference between that 48 megapixel image and that 12 megapixel image. I mean, you're probably not going to be able to tell the difference between that 48 megapixel image and like a 6 megapixel image, right? If we're viewing on a 2-inch screen, even a really good 2-inch screen, you don't need all that data. Now, if you're viewing it bigger, if you're viewing it on a computer, if you're going to print it, I mean, back here, I've got this mega picture on the wall. I think it's a 20 by 24 print. Yeah, that data is going to matter. And I'm a big fan of printing wall art. Like I said, I've got that there in my office. I've got a couple more up over here. I've got, some other art on the walls. So I'm a big fan of printing, and I'm a big fan of printing big. And for that printing big, the more detail, the better. You're going to create much better images with that 48 megapixel camera than you probably were with a smaller sensor. But, let's be honest, if your MO is to capture on your phone and shoot to post to Instagram, and that's it, you don't need the 48 megapixels. Just leave it on 12. It's going to work out really well. The AI processing in the Apple camera app is very smart. It will do smart things, turning those 48 megapixels into 12 megapixels. And, and that will all be good for you. So I think that's the big interesting news on the iPhone camera, is all those megapixels and what do you do with them? One of the other questions that I've seen come up a few times is talking about the new 2x view that we have in the iPhone camera app. If you go into the camera app and have a Pro phone, in addition to the 0.5x, the 1x, and the 3x, you now see a 2x. There's not a fourth lens on the camera. The camera has the same 3 lenses on it that it did with the iPhone 13 Pro. A little bit of glare there. Gotta love my light. Big fan of the Elgato key light for streaming. But my new phone is so shiny, I haven't scuffed it up enough yet. We've still got the 3 camera lenses. We don't have a 2x lens. What that 2x lens is it is simply a crop to the center of the 48 megapixel 1x wide lens. And so they are, cropping in and using that middle of that sensor. It's not it's not really a digital zoom in that it's not capturing bigger and then enlarging, which is usually what we think of when we think of digital zoom. It really is just a crop. That said, it is an optical crop, right? There's no digital processing that's happening to those cropped pixels, beyond all the digital processing that happens to every pixel we capture with our iPhone, right? And so, I haven't photographed enough with my new phone to see how that will play out. With my old phone, my iPhone 11 and the predecessors, I use the super wide rarely. I probably should use it more. I think it's one of the more interesting lenses. It's I saw Tyler Stallman posting on his channel with some of his comments on the new cameras, and I'll drop a link down below so you can check that out because he had some good stuff to say. But one of the things he commented was he thinks the 0.5x, the ultra wide camera, is fairly underrated, and he's probably right. I use that rarely. I use the 1x a lot. I use the 3x a lot. I think it's one of the reasons why, even if I wasn't a pro photographer, I would probably still get the pro camera because I love having that optical zoom. Now, granted, it's only 77 millimeters, but it's a decent lens, and it did get an upgrade. It got a new sensor with the iPhone 14 Pro, even though it's still the same, focal length. And so that 2x, we'll see how it plays into my workflow. I'm used to using the 3x and maybe doing a little bit of cropping and post-processing. Will I do it in the camera with the 2x? We'll see how it plays out. Leave a comment in the chat if that's something that you're finding yourself doing or not doing so far. One of the questions that came up earlier, and it came up in a question on one of my previous videos. It came up in my reaction video, the one that got quite a few views. Again, I'll drop links to all this stuff below in the chat, or in the description. But one of the questions was, if you photograph a 48 megapixel image in RAW format, can you just convert that to a 48 megapixel JPEG, right? Apple won't give you a 48 megapixel JPEG or a 48 megapixel HEIC file out of the camera. But if you capture in RAW, can you convert it to JPEG? And the answer is yes. You can. Once you have that data, you have 48 megapixels worth of data, and you can bring that into a photo editing app and convert it to another format, JPEG, TIFF, PNG, whatever you'd want to do. Now, will it look, what will it look like? Well, that depends on the raw processing that you do, right? If you're capturing in RAW format, you're going to need to do more processing. In fact, let me, hold on. I've got my iPad over here that I'm also using. Let me bring up an image for an example. If you capture in RAW, I guess I don't have that image on that phone. Well, that's a fail on my part. What I was going to show you is that, those RAW files are going to be dark, right? Often, especially if they're indoors, they're not going to have had kind of the, that smart HDR and that processing done to them where it brings up the shadows and things like that. And so you're going to need to do additional processing to those. Now, you can pull a lot of detail out. Sebastian from Lux, from the company that makes Halide, posted a photo on Twitter recently. It's been getting a lot of play. Where he brought a ton of detail out of the shadows with one of the new iPhone 14 RAW files. So I'm looking forward to getting out there and playing around, putting it into a real world environment for some extensive shooting, getting out there. I'm curious to know what you're looking to do with it. How extensively do you use your iPhone? Do you add a lot of accessories to it? I'm one of those relatively minimal photographers when it comes to my iPhone photography. I will occasionally put it on a tripod or a mobile tripod or things like that. My favorite accessories, I would say, probably for that, my favorite accessory for a tripod stand, is the switch pod, which is nice and handheld. It has a standard, thread mount on the top. It opens up like this and can sit down on a table and be used as a tabletop tripod. The switch pod is neat. What I usually do with that, it's disassembled at the moment, but I put a little ball head on top of that. And on top of that ball head, I have the Glyph mount from Studio Neat, which is a nice, simple mount that springs open, comes down, clamps, holds that iPhone plenty secure. With the ball head, I can flip that 90 degrees if I want to go vertical or horizontal. It swivels around. So switch pod plus ball head plus Glyph is my favorite way to mount that iPhone when I'm out and about. Any other questions folks have got? Feel free to drop that into the comment, and I would love to respond to that to see what are your iPhone questions. Yeah, so a question just came up on setting configuration for macro if image stacking isn't possible. And, I think I recognize that name. I think you might be the person who asked me about that in the comments on a previous video. If so, welcome back. If not, I'm glad you're here. And yeah, the question that had come up was, could the iPhone do stacking for macro images? And for those who aren't familiar with that, it's a term. Focus stacking is often used with macro photography, where a photographer will capture a bunch of different images with varying focal points, so as to get the maximum sharpness and merge those together. Because we know when we go macro, if we're looking at something like a flower, if we're looking at, I guess that's probably the prototypical macro subject, right? As I'm in the middle of a flower, focus stacking allows you to get that maximum sharpness, even though you might have a shallow depth of field for each given image. And typically this merging is done, or at least traditionally has been done in post-processing, either in an application like Photoshop or with a plugin designed for it or things like that. With the iPhone, I guess it was with the iPhone 13 last year that Apple officially added a macro capability to the camera app. And that macro capability is something that by default, iOS will do. iOS will prompt me for my password instead of Face IDing. The macro mode is something that iOS will do by default. There's an option in the camera settings to give yourself an icon in the camera app to turn it on or off by default instead of having it switch automatically. But as far as, the ideal settings for that, I would, either way, either manually or automatically get into that macro mode, let iOS do what it thinks it wants to do. The other thing I would explore, and I have not done this personally, macro is not something I do all the time, but what you might look at is using an app like Halide or one of the other apps that allows you to photograph in a more manual mode as opposed to automatic, in that it will allow you to adjust the settings as far as shutter speed and as far as, where you're focusing. And I would play around with it and see what you can get. The challenge I think you're going to run into is, because iOS uses that tap to focus, it's not quite as precise as you would get if you have a traditional camera lens with a focusing ring where you can, put your hand on it and tactily feel as you slowly pivot that focusing ring. You can feel and you can kind of see that focus adjust in your viewfinder. That's kind of interesting, though. I will admit focus stacking on the iPhone is not something I've heard a lot come across my world, but I'm sure you're not the first person to do that. And just doing a quick Google of, focus stacking on iPhone, what I'm finding is it looks like there are some apps that are kind of designed for this. I see there's one called Focus Stacker. There's one called, Where's the other name I just saw? Um, Stay focused. What was the other one? Helicon. Yeah. And so it looks like if you're into focus stacking, that may be something where the default camera app isn't going to serve you super well, but it sounds like there may be some specialized apps that are good for that. Good question on better macro with the 48 meg Pro RAW than 12. That's a good question. I would have to play around. I mean, I would expect that you're going to get the same advantages in the macro mode that you get in, in the regular non-macro modes in the camera, going to the 48 meg versus the 48 megapixel versus the 12 megapixel, raw images, in that you're going to get more data. Now, being in macro mode, depending on what you're photographing, that more data may or may not play out in kind of a better, end result, right? So if I'm really close on a flower, that more data might result in a more meaningful or a more subtle gradation, for example, as the color moves along a flower petal or something like that. Or it may not. It might actually turn out to be overkill. So yeah, that focus stacking on macro, I'm going to have to look into that more. That's something, like I said, that I haven't played a lot with myself on my iPhone at all. I tried around, did a little bit with it on my big camera, on my DSLR a few years back. But I haven't played around too much with it on mobile. On mobile, I did use the macro mode last year with the iPhone 13 Pro and had some fun with that, but I never got into doing focus stacking. And so, yeah, if it sounds like at least some of the apps are maybe old, it'd be a good question, because obviously a 5-year-old app isn't going to know anything about Apple's new macro camera mode that it has in the iPhone 13 and 14 Pro. So yeah, it was a good question. And it's given me something to explore. What can I get up close and personal with, whether it's a flower or something around the office, or a microphone, or who knows. So I'm going to have to check that out. Good question though. So yeah. All right. That's some good stuff. And, it's interesting. I feel like right now we're in that period where we're a few days post iPhone release, where we're seeing all the apps kind of update to account for little things that we either knew or didn't know were coming, including Apple. Apple has already acknowledged a couple bugs. One issue that some people are seeing, I'm not running into it yet, but it is actually a pretty serious issue with the iPhone 14 Pros. Some people are seeing in third-party camera apps such as Instagram or Snapchat that when they go to use the camera from within these apps, there's something screwy with the optical image stabilization in the 14 Pro's camera, and they can actually hear the camera making those OIS, making that whirring or that clunking noise as it tries to stabilize and focus in those apps. Now, I haven't seen this personally, but I've definitely seen a few reports of it online. Apple has acknowledged it, it sounds like, as a bug. And I would expect, it's something where we're going to see a firmware update to those sooner rather than later. I've seen a couple other things that Apple's acknowledged where the copy paste, the paste permissions warning is pretty rampant, and you're seeing it way more often than you should in iOS 16. And so I would expect, we're almost a week after I guess we're about a week after the iOS 16 release at this point. I would expect we will see an update to iOS to address a few of these issues pretty quickly. We'll see those betas get out, and then we'll see a release come out to the general public. There was one more question I see around how could the iPhone add photo stacking capability? And I think I don't think this is going to be more of a focus question than a how could it do the stacking question, right? Because I think the limiting factor in my head, and feel free to drop a comment if you have other thoughts, but in my mind, the limiting factor is the focus capability and how you set focus, right? Because right now with the iPhone, pretty much regardless of which camera app you use, you're using your screen and you're using your big meaty finger to tap, where you want the focus to be set in an image, in a scene. And, the width of the end of your finger is not super precise, right? It's kind of the difference between using the end of your finger and using like an Apple Pencil or something that's very precise if you were drawing. And so because you don't have that preciseness for setting focus, setting that focus is kind of, I don't want to say it's kludgy, but it doesn't have that precision. Whereas, a photographer who's into focus stacking with a traditional lens that has a rotating focus ring on the lens can clearly, and in a methodical fashion, set that focal point at various points along their subject, and get a more consistent result from that. And so I feel like in order to do that with the iPhone, you would have to have an app that allowed you to kind of manually adjust that focal distance with something more precise than just tapping your finger, mushing your finger onto the screen. So yeah, I appreciate the input, and it's interesting. That's something I'll have to look into it more, both personally, but I'm also going to talk to a few people that I know that are in kind of the nature and landscape photography world. There's at least a couple names that are coming to mind of people I know who I want to ask them if that's something that they have explored with their iPhones. Because as we find the quality of the iPhones getting better and better, we're finding less and less reasons to carry our big cameras with us. And is this something where the iPhone has gotten to the point where it can replace the big camera yet, or not? My gut says it may not be able to handle the focus as precisely as we need it to right now, but I definitely have zero firsthand expertise in trying that out with the iPhone. So I don't want to go make a definitive statement. There's too many people on the internet that make definitive statements about things they haven't tried. And that circles right back to that Reddit thread I was talking about at the beginning of the stream, where, there were all sorts of people with their hypothetical arguments on why the iPhone was going to be terrible. So good deal. All right. Well, hey, this has been fun. I've hit several things I want to do. We're at about half an hour, and I think that is probably a good number to kind of wrap things up. Focus stacking is to focus as HDR is to exposure. Similar. Yeah, I think that's a fair analogy. I'm sure we could nitpick at it and maybe pick it apart, but I think in a lot of ways it is. Focus stacking is using, a lot of times I hear the term slicing, but basically taking the sharp part of a bunch of different photos and merging those together, whereas HDR, either done automatically, like with the iPhone Smart HDR, or done manually in HDR, software, is taking the best exposed part of a bunch of different photographs and merging those together. I think that's an apt analogy that you can make there. So, yeah. Well, good deal. Hey, thanks for those of you who joined me live, and thank you for those who are watching this as a replay. Once it goes up for replay, I will be sure to add links in the description to several of those things that I've chatted about today. If you aren't already subscribed to the channel, please do so. I talk a lot about modern tech photo things, especially mobile photography lately. So if you subscribe, you're going to get more of this kind of content coming your way. And if you turn on those notifications and, leave comments and hit the like button and all that fun stuff, just tells YouTube that I'm saying something interesting and that more people should know about it. So I appreciate your support with that. On that note, go out there, have fun with your new iPhone, have fun with your old iPhone. Either way, just go make some photos. And I'd love to hear what you're doing. If you want to get the latest from me, I do a lot of photography stuff online beyond just the YouTube channel. go to techphotoguy.com. You can subscribe right on the homepage with your email address, and about once a week I'll send you an email with kind of a roundup of all the best tech photo stuff I've seen online, not just from me, but from people across the internet who are doing all sorts of fascinating things, whether that be mobile, whether that be editing, whether that be AI software, whether that be new hardware, cameras, lenses, gear. It all crosses my desk and I share the best stuff. So thanks again for being here. It was great to have you all here, and I look forward to chatting more with you again soon. Take care.